Good afternoon. Yes, I work for the CBC. And most of you probably know that the CBC is a public broadcaster, and we get most of our funding from the federal government. Not all of it, most of it though. So I hope you don't think it's too impertinent of me if I share the following quotation with you. Every government is run by liars, and nothing they say should be believed. That's not me talking. That's I.F. Stone. If you don't know who I.F. Stone was, I really do urge you to find out a little bit about him. He was an American muckraking journalist in the 30s and 40s and 50s. He started out in the mainstream, but he very quickly became an independent journalist and really held powerful interests to account in Washington. Did some fantastic work. And this was his credo. He didn't believe in the spinners. He wanted to find out what was really going on. And so he put out an independent weekly publication that was very popular. It was small, but it was extremely influential. The main thing he tried to find out about was the truth. That was his main mission. So, speaking of truth, let me share another quotation with you. This one's from Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of England, and he said, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." And what I really like about this quotation is that it kind of sums up what a lot of us already know in our guts, which is that governments and other powerful institutions don't always level with us. Sometimes they lie to us. If you believe Churchill, it's necessary that they lie to us in times of war. But if you think of other contexts, like say the war on terror, then you realize that a lot of lies have been told through the years. Lies about the existence of weapons of mass destruction. Lies about whether someone is or is not a terrorist and therefore ought to be renditioned to some other country. I've heard a lot of mea culpas in different conferences and different contexts from some of my American journalist colleagues. They feel shy and bashful that in the post-9/11 environment, they weren't challenging enough with their own governments. They were caught up in a lot of the patriotic fervor of the time. And now they regret that. And of course, it's important that you don't look back on these things in retrospect, but that you seize the moment when it's happening, and you're always vigilant about holding powerful interests to account. We all know about the shooting in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago. We all heard some patriotic fervor sweeping up over that. But even at times like that, it's important, I think, that journalists do their jobs. And a key part of that job is always seeking the truth, always being skeptical about what powerful interests are saying. So I don't want to trivialize the conversation by showing you the following quote, but I think this is interesting to note. This is more of an apocryphal kind of quote. It's usually said to have come from a crusty old city editor talking to a new reporter. And it goes like this: if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. That's simple enough advice. It's good advice because it means we should always be skeptical as journalists. There's a problem with this, though, and I'll get to those problems in a second. First, let me just take a second to maybe talk to you a little bit about where this whole idea comes from, that journalists even have the right to hold powerful interests to account. What gives us that right? I won't go into this in depth, but a lot of ideas from the Enlightenment justify this concept, whether you look at what John Milton wrote about freedom of expression and his attacks on the censorship laws of the time in 17th century England, whether you look at some of the thoughts of the American and French revolutionary leaders, they all defended the right of freedom of expression and freedom of the press as a really cornerstone aspect of democracy. Have a look at what Thomas Jefferson said, for instance. "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." So, what's the message? The message is we have to be watchdogs. But there's a problem. In fact, there's several problems with this. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what some of those problems are, because powerful interests don't often like to be scrutinized. And sometimes they fight back at that. Problem number one, access. I've been a journalist for quite a long time. In the olden days, I used to use the phone a lot. I used to call up politicians and get them on the phone, sometimes go knock on their doors. It's much more difficult to do that today. Politicians surround themselves with this gigantic barrier of public relations and communications specialists. And it's very difficult to get access to them, to ask them a question. This becomes a really big problem. I want to show you a little illustration of what I'm talking about. This is a graph that talks about the ratio of journalists to public relations and communications specialists. You'll see on the bottom in 1980, that ratio was about 1.2 to 1. 1.2 public relations and communications people to 1. By 2004, it had grown to 3.2 to 1. And by 2013, last year, the ratio was 4.6 to 1. It's a little bit of an uneven fight. That's a problem. Problem number 2 is transparency. Of course, governments like to say they're very transparent. In Canada, we've had an Access to Information Act for a little over 30 years. But again, I'm old enough to know what that act was like before, what Canada was like before that act came into force. Before it came into force, if I asked government for some information and they wouldn't give it to me, I could write an article saying they're refusing to give it to me, and they'd have to be politically accountable for that. Today, they can point to mandatory exclusions and different pieces of this Access to Information Act that says, well, sorry, we'd love to give you this information, but we just can't. Let me show you a typical document that our shop accesses under Access to Information. You'll see a lot of white on this document. We had asked for information about drug testing on Canadian Forces bases in Canada. So as you can see, most of it is whited out. And then I guess somebody discovered that not enough was whited out, so they took a black felt marker and blacked some of the rest of it out. So there's not a lot of information here. If you ask any journalist, they will tell you that access to information is very frustrating for them. It involves many delays, it involves high fee estimates, it involves government officials trying to dodge and divert, and involves these kinds of redactions. And it's led people like Tom Henheffer, with the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, to say this: the government has essentially done everything they can to make access to information impossible. He's with the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. Problem number 3. This is a problem that I like to say is a contradiction between practitioners and their institutions. What do I mean by that? When you're holding power to account, a lot of the big media organizations in the world are powerful in their own right. So this often leads to a contradiction between the work of a practitioner and the work of the institution. I want to talk about an example. This is an image of Gary Webb. Some of you may know who that is. There's actually a motion picture out right now about him called Kill the Messenger. He worked for the San Jose Mercury News in the 90s. He wrote this incredible series of articles called Dark Alliance. It talked about how the CIA-backed Contras were actually financing a lot of their work by selling crack cocaine in Los Angeles and other parts of the United States. What happened is the US administration attacked him. Attacked his story, which was well documented. Some of the other big mainstream media attacked his story, and eventually his own newspaper backed away from the story. It ended quite badly for Mr. Webb. He was demoted, he left his job, he couldn't find another job with the media. He ended up killing himself a few years later. It's quite a tragic story. By the way, a commission of inquiry subsequently found that all his conclusions, or the vast majority of his conclusions, were correct. Problem number 4, this is what I call the problem within individual journalists. And this can be quite an insidious one. And that's the feeling that in order for me as a journalist to succeed and to get ahead, I have to play nice. I shouldn't rock the boat. I might not get that scoop. Somebody might not give me that document or that piece of information that I need. So I better be really careful and not ask all those nosy questions. Unfortunately, some journalists like that do get rewarded with scoops from government or opposition or powerful interests. So it's a bit of a conundrum. I want to show you what Neil MacDonald of the CBC. Neil MacDonald is a CBC correspondent. He's currently in Washington, never shy about expressing his opinions. Here's what he has to say about this process. Canadian journalism is far too inclined to genuflect to power. Institutions are given the benefit of the doubt. Marginal voices, or voices of those who think too far outside the conventional box, are ignored. I've seen this in practice up close for a long time, and it is a problem. Here's the final, maybe biggest problem facing the investigative journalist, facing the journalist who wants to hold powerful interests to account. It's the outright threats that come from those very same powerful interests. What kind of threats am I talking about? I'm talking about the threat of a lawsuit, the threat of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. I'm talking about political pressure that comes to bear either on the institution you work for, or your bosses, or the people who can influence the type of work you can do. I'm talking about the threat of jail. There's no protection for journalists to protect confidential sources right now, so sometimes if you really want to protect that confidential source, you have to risk going to jail. And I'm talking about physical violence in some respects, because a lot of journalists have been subjected to that in many parts of the world. So there are a lot of serious threats of this nature. You all know about Julian Assange, who with WikiLeaks worked to release a whole bunch of sensitive information about US military, US diplomatic corps. He's now holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, afraid of retribution if he should come out of there. Some of you may know about Glenn Greenwald, the journalist who worked with Edward Snowden to reveal the very shocking revelations about national security in the United States and in different parts of the world. James Risen, a reporter with the New York Times, who is being threatened with prosecution because he won't reveal who some of his key sources were for some of the books and articles he's written. These are some of the real-life examples of journalists who have faced these types of threats. So, holding power to account isn't just desirable, in my view. I think it's really essential. It's essential if we care about our democracy. And I want to leave you now with the words of a Toronto mayor. Not the mayor you're thinking about. Not even the mayor that was just elected last week or a couple weeks ago in Toronto, but the very first mayor of Toronto, William Lyon Mackenzie. And he was also, by the way, a very interesting guy. He was the leader of the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837. And on top of all of that, he was probably Canada's very first investigative journalist, in my opinion. And here's what he had to say. He said this: "Censure of government causes inquiry and produces discontent among the people. And this discontent is the only means known to me of removing the defects of a vicious government and inducing the rulers to remedy the abuses. Thus the press, by its power of censure, is the best safeguard of the interests of mankind." Mackenzie was a journalist. He was also a politician. He was all of that wrapped into one, but mainly he held powerful interests to account. And when it came to doing that, he was really a master. So I hope you'll agree with me that holding powerful interests to account is a principle that we have to continue to encourage and support. Thank you.